Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show where we dig into a pile of sources, articles, studies, notes, and pull out the key insights, basically giving you a shortcut to really understanding complex topics.
And today, we're tackling something that, well, it feels pretty relevant right now.
Absolutely. Have you ever felt that kind of background hum of anxiety, that unsettling feeling when you look at the news and it just seems like one crisis after another? Climate change, pandemics, geopolitical stuff. It feels like the ground is constantly shifting under our feet.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process, isn't it? The sheer amount of alarming news can be overwhelming. Hard to know what's signal and what's noise.
Exactly. But what if I told you there are people out there, specialists even, who don't just react to all this chaos and uncertainty, people who actually study it, navigate it, and maybe even, profit from it?
That's what we're diving into today. We
Yeah.
want to understand the architecture of crisis, you could say. How does it work? How do people think about it?
Right. Our sources today give us some pretty compelling insights into, for example, how certain Wall Street traders are navigating and, making billions in this exact era of global warming, pandemics, geopolitical risk, all of it.
It's a fascinating window into how this seemingly chaotic world can actually be analyzed, maybe even understood. And crucially, how some people try to prepare for the really big disruptions.
So our mission today is to unpack some key concepts that help frame all this. We're talking black swans, dragon kings. We'll venture into Fat Tail City, mathematically speaking, and wrestle with wicked problems.
Yeah, we won't just define these terms. We want to see how they actually play out, in the real world.
Right.
Financial markets, sure, but also global health, environmental challenges.
And this isn't just abstract theory or high finance stuff that doesn't affect you. This is about getting a clearer lens, maybe, to view the big disruptions shaping your life, shaping the world around all of us.
What does it really mean to be ready for the unthinkable? Or, maybe even more confusingly, for the catastrophe that seems predictable but still catches us completely off guard?
Okay, so to really get a feel for this architecture of crisis, maybe the best place to start is with a story. A concrete example from just a few years ago when the world suddenly felt different, seen through the eyes of a major Wall Street player.
Exactly. Let's go back to early 2020. Picture this. Bill Ackman, founder, CEO of Pershing Square Capital Management, a big name, manages billions. The novel coronavirus, COVID-19, is just starting to creep out of Wuhan.
And Ackman has this immediate visceral reaction.
He does. He apparently thought to himself almost instantly, it's over. The virus has escaped to the world, just like that.
Wow, it's over. That's intense. That captures a huge shift in thinking right there.
It really does. And from that point, he immediately starts rethinking everything. His firm's huge investments, billions of dollars. He owned a lot of Hilton stock, for example.
Oh, okay. Hotel.
Right. He instantly saw it. Hotels, airlines, cruises, they could effectively go to zero if this thing really spiraled. Travel stops, people stay home, done.
And Chipotle, too, right? He had a big stake there.
Yep. Suddenly, Chipotle wasn't just a burrito place. It was another time bomb, totally vulnerable to lockdowns. He looked at his whole portfolio and saw basically a powder keg of risk.
You can almost feel the panic radiating from that. And it wasn't just professional concern, was it? It got personal.
Oh, absolutely. The story goes early February, he's in a meeting talking about his growing worries about the virus. And the person across from him starts coughing.
Oh, no.
Ackman just bolts, rushes out of the room. He was scared for himself, sure, but apparently also really worried about potentially infecting his elderly father.
Understandable. So what did he do next?
He quickly decides to shut down the Pershing Square office, tells everyone, work from home. But here's the interesting bit. Shows you how he's thinking strategically even in panic. He doesn't want to freak out his employees, who maybe aren't quite grasping the scale of this yet. So he frames it as just a short-term disaster recovery test.
Smart, but also a bit chilling, knowing what was coming.
Definitely. A masterclass in managing perception, maybe. But it shows the private alarm bells were ringing loud and clear long before the public ones.
And he didn't just shut the office and wait, did he? He saw an opportunity, a terrifying one, maybe, but still.
Exactly. He made a move that, honestly, most people at the time would have called crazy nuts. A huge contrarian bet. He bought insurance contracts, credit default swaps.
Okay, explain those simply, like insurance against companies going bust.
Pretty much. He spent just $26 million on these swaps, but they were tied to a massive $71 billion worth of corporate debt. U.S. investment-grade stuff, European bonds, even junk bonds.
So he wasn't insuring his own stuff, he was betting against a huge chunk of the economy.
You got it. He literally called it fire insurance. Insurance that pays out big time if those bond indexes representing thousands of companies got torched.
Ed got torched.
Oh, did they ever. Soon after, the bond market started seizing up. Investors finally started seeing the nightmare Ackman had pictured. Whole industries, hotels, airlines, theme parks, restaurants, retail, facing potential bankruptcy.
So everyone suddenly wanted that insurance he'd bought.
Exactly. And the price of those swaps he bought for pennies on the dollar. They exploded. At one point, his $26 million bet was worth so much, it represented 1/3 of Pershing Square's entire assets under management.
1/3?
Yeah.
From $26 million. That's astronomical.
An almost unimaginable win. A bonanza, really.
So what did he do? Cash out and buy an island?
Yeah, no. This is maybe even the gutsiest part. You know that old saying, buy when there's blood in the streets?
Yeah, Baron Rothschild.
Ackman took it literally. He didn't just bank the win. He took his massive profit, $2.6 billion, and plowed it right back into the stock market.
Wait, when?
March 2020. Just as the pandemic was really taking off, millions losing jobs. Remember those images of spring breakers partying like nothing was happening? That's when he was buying.
Buying what? Stuff that was getting hammered.
Yep. Back into Hilton, Berkshire Hathaway, Starbucks, Lowe's. While most people were running for the exits, terrified, he was reinvesting. Though he did admit later he was scared it could all go to zero if the U.S. couldn't control the virus and the whole system just broke.
Incredible nerve. But was Ackman's play just a brilliant one-off reaction, or is there a more systematic way to think about this?
That's a perfect question because it brings us to Mark Spitznagel and Universa Investments. Ackman reacted decisively, sure. But Universa, their whole reason for existing is chaos.
How so?
They're a hedge fund basically designed to always thrive on chaos, not just react when it hits. Their strategy isn't about predicting when the next crash will happen.
Just knowing that it will eventually.
Exactly. They assume it will strike, and they position themselves for it constantly, relentlessly. It's a fundamentally different approach.
So how does that work in practice? What are they actually doing?
Spitznagel calls it fire insurance for portfolios.
Yeah.
Much like Ackman's analogy, they are perpetually positioned for market crashes. The idea is that their clients can sleep at night.
Because they don't need to guess the timing.
Right. They know the protection is there. Spitznagel argues it's always a better risk mitigation strategy, gives you more crash bang for the buck, as he puts it. Their clients might see small, steady costs during calm markets, paying the insurance premium, essentially. But the idea is those costs are tiny compared to the massive gains when a crash actually happens.
Interesting. So some people were clearly seeing the risks early on, like Ackman and Universa, but the wider world, not so much.
Largely ignored, yeah. Nassim Taleb, we'll talk a lot more about him. He was sounding the alarm about the coronavirus back in January 2020. Him and Yaneer Baryam at the New England Complex Systems Institute, NECSI.
And people just weren't listening, even with, planes flying everywhere.
Pretty much. Their warnings fell on deaf ears, despite the obvious risk of rapid global spread in our hyper-connected world.
What were they saying specifically back then?
They put out a memo, Systemic Risk, on January 24th, 2020. And it was blunt. It basically said, panic now, panic early.
Panic early. That sounds drastic.
Their logic was clear. You had to break the chain of contagion immediately, stop physical interactions. Because if you didn't, the potential downside wasn't just bad. It was what they called a ruin problem for humanity.
Okay, ruin problem. That sounds terrifyingly final. Connect that to something practical, like the gambler idea.
Exactly. Think of a gambler using the martingale strategy, doubling their bet every time they lose. Seems like a sure win eventually, right?
Yeah, you have to win sometime.
But unless you have literally infinite money, you will eventually hit a losing streak long enough to wipe you out completely. That's gambler's ruin. For humanity, a ruin problem is an existential threat, something that could cause irreversible destruction, total collapse.
And pandemics are different now because we're so connected.
Vastly different. Historically, plagues might devastate a region, but they move slower. Now, with global air travel, mega cities, a local outbreak can become a global catastrophe almost overnight. Our Uber-networked global society makes that ruin problem more of a threat than ever.
So their advice wasn't just panic, it was based on this statistical idea of avoiding total ruin.
Yes, and it led them to advocate for the precautionary principle.
Which means?
It means you take action to reduce the risk of ruin, even if you don't have perfect certainty or a neat cost-benefit analysis that says you should. If the potential harm is severe and irreversible, like mass death, extinction, you act decisively to prevent it, even if it's costly now.
That sounds logical, but it wasn't the prevailing view at the time, was it?
Not really. Many experts and politicians were more focused on, the economic impact, the disruption of lockdowns. They weren't talking in terms of potential systemic collapse or applying this kind of radical precautionary thinking. Prevention, even costly prevention, was Taleb and Bar-Yam's absolute priority.
Which makes what happened next in the markets even weirder, right? March 2020, the economy is cratering, jobs disappearing. But stocks started going up.
It was truly uncanny. After that initial sharp drop, indexes just started climbing. It seemed completely detached from the grim reality on the ground. Irrational exuberance doesn't even begin to cover it.
So it drove that. Just hope.
Mostly money. Unprecedented amounts of it pumped into the system by central banks and governments. The Federal Reserve started buying not just government bonds, but corporate bonds, even junk bonds, basically backstopping everything.
Wow.
And governments rolled out trillions in stimulus checks, extra unemployment benefits, business loans. All that cash had to go somewhere. And with interest rates near zero, bonds weren't attractive. So a lot of it flooded into the stock market, inflating asset bubbles.
So Spitznagel would see that as just more fuel for the next fire.
Exactly. He called it more TNT, just building up pressure for an even bigger explosion down the line, creating this artificial sense of stability on top of incredibly shaky foundations.
And then there's this idea of the polycrisis from Adam Tooze. It's not just multiple things going wrong at once, is it?
No, it's much more dangerous than that. A polycrisis is when different crises, say, a pandemic, inflation, climate shocks, war, start interacting and amplifying each other. The whole becomes much worse than the sum of its parts.
Like dominoes falling, but also setting each other on fire.
That's a good way to put it. The pandemic messes up supply chains, which causes inflation, which leads to recession fears, which might fuel political instability, which could worsen a refugee crisis. It's these feedback loops that make it so dangerous. An age of disasters, Tooze calls it.
And we're seeing examples everywhere. Rain on Greenland's ice sheet for the first time ever.
Unprecedented shock, yeah. August 2021. Clear sign of accelerating climate change.
Political division in the U.S. being called a bomb exploding.
Studies suggesting it's reaching a critical point, potentially irreversible polarization.
And just the sheer frequency of extreme weather, mega fires, superstorms, mega droughts, it feels less like isolated events and more like a new, terrifying normal.
It really paints a picture of escalating challenges, interconnected risks. A sense that, yeah, maybe hell is coming, as some of these sources starkly put it, and maybe we're not ready.
A sobering thought, which makes understanding the frameworks for these events even more critical. Let's start with maybe the most famous one, the Black Swan, popularized by Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Right. Taleb came at this from the trenches, basically. He traded complex financial instruments, derivatives, options. He wasn't just an academic observing from afar. He felt the markets, and he became convinced they were way riskier than the standard models assumed.
Because the models were too
neat, too reliant on bell curves, yeah. He made a killing on Black Monday in 1987, that day the Dow dropped over 22%. Nobody saw that coming based on standard models. He also watched other huge blowups happen, Orange County going bankrupt in 94, the long-term capital management hedge fund collapsing in 98, and nearly taking the whole system down with it.
So those weren't just blips to him, they were signs of something deeper.
Exactly. Signs that led him to define a black swan. It's got three characteristics.
Yeah.
It's an outlier. Totally outside normal expectations. It has an extreme impact. And even though it was unpredictable before it happened, human nature makes us cook up explanations after the fact, making it seem predictable in hindsight.
Like the discovery of actual black swans in Australia. Europeans just assumed all swans were white until then.
Precisely. It shatters your existing framework, and it leads to his famous turkey problem.
Ah, yes, the turkey. Explain that one. It's such a good analogy.
It really is. Imagine a turkey, right? Every day for 1,000 days, the farmer comes, feeds it, takes care of it.
Yeah.
From the turkey's point of view, based on all available data, life is great, stable, predictable. The farmer is clearly a benevolent figure.
Each day confirms its belief in safety.
Exactly. Its confidence grows daily. But then comes day 1001, mid-November maybe, and the farmer shows up with different intentions.
Thanksgiving.
A single event, completely outside the turkey's 1,000 days of data, totally catastrophic, and utterly unpredictable from the turkey's perspective. It brutally shows how relying on past stability can blind you to extreme, game-changing risks. We often act like that turkey.
It's a chilling thought. And Taleb's book, The Black Swan, it just exploded, didn't it? The term became ubiquitous.
Oh, yeah. It became, as someone put it, a universal meme for surprising bad shit going down. Usage of the term skyrocketed after his book came out. But Taleb himself got endlessly tortured by how people misused it.
What did they get wrong? Like, was 9/11 a black swan?
Well, Taleb would say, yes, it was a black swan for the victims in the towers, caught completely by surprise. But for the terrorists who planned it, absolutely not. It was meticulously orchestrated.
Okay, that makes sense. Perspective matters. What about the 2008 financial crisis? Surely that was a black swan.
Nope. Taleb consistently argued it wasn't. He called it a gray swan.
Gray swan.
Yeah, meaning it was predictable in principle. Even if the exact timing or trigger was hard to pin down, he felt the systemic risks, the dodgy mortgages, the leverage. That was all visible beforehand if you looked properly. The failure was ignoring the signs, not that the signs weren't there.
So the models were wrong, the thinking was wrong. It wasn't truly unforeseeable like a black swan.
That was his point. He felt the quantitative analysts might know about fat tails theoretically, but they kept using their flawed bell curve models anyway, creating this dangerous illusion of safety.
Okay, so if black swans are, by definition, unpredictable, how on earth do you prepare? How do you build a strategy around something you can't see coming? That brings us back to Mark Spitznagel, right? Taleb's collaborator.
He does. Spitznagel tackled exactly that problem, starting with a really counterintuitive idea, the discipline of loving to lose.
Loving to lose, that sounds masochistic.
It does. His journey started super young, 16 years old, on the trading floor of the Chicago Board of Trade, the CBOT. He described it as just utter chaos, yet somehow organized chaos. A real pressure cooker.
And he found a mentor there.
Yeah, a legendary corn trader named Everett Klipp, known as the Babe Ruth of the CBOT. And Klipp taught him this seemingly mind-bending philosophy. Successful traders love to lose and hate to win.
Okay, unpack that. Love to lose, hate to win. How does that make sense?
It means you obsess about cutting your losses short, immediately. You don't let small losses turn into catastrophic ones. Winning trades? Fine. But the real key to survival, Klipp taught him, was avoiding the blow-up trader talk for losing everything, going bust.
So it's about risk management above all else, taking small hits constantly to avoid the knockout punch.
Exactly. It became Spitznagel's iron law, a natural reflex he had to force himself to learn, because it goes against every human instinct to hold on, hope things turn around, avoid admitting you're wrong.
I can imagine that's incredibly hard psychologically. Did he struggle with it?
Oh, for sure. Klipp hammered it into him. Panic early. Cut losses now. Don't wait. That discipline is what kept Klipp trading successfully for decades, while others crashed and burned. Spitznagel learned it the hard way in the Treasury bond pit.
Starting at the bottom?
Yeah, down in the hole, he called it, like the cheap properties in Monopoly. But he slowly climbed the ranks, the tiers, to become a big dog, a major player. And he credits surviving the 1994 bond market massacre, where lots of supposedly sophisticated traders got wiped out directly to sticking rigidly to Klipp's love-to-lose rule. He even made money.
So that experience solidified it for him. The calm before the storm is an illusion.
A complete illusion. He realized that stability was just setting the stage for the inevitable disruption.
Okay, so we have unpredictable black swans, and the strategy is extreme risk management, loving to lose. But what if some big, devastating events aren't totally unpredictable? What if they're foreseeable?
This brings us to Didier Sornette and his Dragon Kings.
Right. Sornette comes from a different background physics. He talks about managing danger from childhood, like riding in a helicopter with his dad who monitored high-voltage power lines. Very precise, very high-stakes work.
Okay, so a physics perspective on risk, how does that apply to markets? He started seeing parallels. Financial crashes, he thought, aren't just random noise. They're more like market ruptures, similar to how materials fail under stress, like a rocket fuel tank reaching its breaking point, or an earthquake fault line finally slipping.
So systems under stress show signs before they break.
That's his core idea. Complex systems, whether physical or financial, often exhibit measurable patterns, a kind of critical signature, as they approach a breaking point. These can act as early warning signs for catastrophes.
So unlike Taleb's black swans that come out of the blue, Sornette is saying some massive disasters actually leave clues.
Exactly. He calls these Dragon Kings. devastating events that are all too foreseeable. It's a direct challenge to the idea that all major shocks are unpredictable black swans.
And he developed a model to find these dragon kings.
Yep, the Johansen-Ledoit-Sornette model, or JLS model. It doesn't claim to predict the exact day of a crash or rally, but it aims to identify windows of time when the system is critically unstable and prone to a sudden, large move.
Has it worked?
He's had some notable calls. He reportedly predicted the October 1997 crash window and a major rally in Japan's Nikkei index in 1999.
How does the model actually detect these windows? What's the signature?
It looks for a specific pattern. Super exponential growth combined with positive feedback loops. Think of a bubble inflating faster and faster and faster, not just growing, but the rate of growth is accelerating exponentially.
Like that snowball rolling downhill, but it's not just getting bigger, it's speeding up its growth rate as it goes.
Perfect analogy. That super exponential growth, driven by feedback loops like herd behavior in markets, pushes the system towards what physicists call a finite time singularity, a point where the math essentially goes infinite, indicating an imminent breakdown or phase transition, like water hitting boiling point.
And that acceleration is detectable beforehand.
That's the claim. It creates a window of visibility before the rupture. He uses Paris as an example. Its historical population growth compared to other French cities showed this super exponential pattern, making it a Dragon King city, driven by unique self-reinforcing dynamics.
So his goal isn't just prediction, it's control. He wants to hunt these dragons.
Der Drachenjäger, the dragon hunter, yes. His ultimate ambition is to figure out how to apply very tiny perturbations at the right moment during that critical window to potentially diffuse the crash before it happens. Nudge the system away from the brink.
Wow. Okay, that's a fundamentally different philosophy than Taleb's accept unpredictability and hedge. This sounds like it must have led to some serious debate between them.
Oh, absolutely. A tense clash of intellects, as it's been described. Their public debate at the New York Academy of Sciences is apparently legendary stuff.
What was the core disagreement?
Well, remember Taleb's gray swans? Events predictable in concept, like the 2008 crisis?
Yeah.
Taleb essentially argued that Sornette's Dragon Kings were just gray swans with a cooler name. He cheekily claimed Sornette had basically repackaged his existing idea.
Huh. Academic turf wars. So is it black, gray, or dragon?
It probably depends on your perspective, right? Taleb's turkey versus butcher analogy comes back here.
Right. The event is the same, but whether it's a surprise depends on who you are and what you know.
Exactly. But Taleb's main point, the one he always comes back to, is crucial. He'd say, it's not your opinion that will ever make you money. The financial instrument or the strategy is vastly more important than whether you guess right.
So don't obsess over predicting, obsess over preparing, having the right tools in place.
Precisely. Which leads us perfectly on to the next part. Why do these extreme events happen so often anyway? What's the math behind it? We need to talk about Fat Tail City.
Right. Beyond the labels Black Swan, Dragon King, there's this underlying mathematical reality. And it seems Benoit Mandelbrot, the fractal guy, was way ahead of the curve on this.
Decades ahead. Mandelbrot argued relentlessly that the standard financial models, the ones built on Gaussian math, the normal distribution, the bell curve, they were fundamentally deeply flawed.
Because the real world isn't that neat.
Not even close, especially in finance. The bell curve assumes things change smoothly, step by step. It assumes volatility is constant. Most importantly, it assumes extreme events are incredibly rare, almost impossible, tucked away in the tiny, skinny tails of the curve.
But Mandelbrot said that's just not how markets behave.
Not at all. He showed that many real-world phenomena, cotton prices going back centuries, river floods, city sizes, and yes, market prices don't follow bell curves. They follow power laws.
Power laws. Okay, what's the key difference?
The tails. In a power law distribution, the tails are fat. That means extreme events, the outliers, are much more probable than the bell curve suggests. You get sudden jumps, wild leaps. Volatility isn't constant. It clusters, it jumps dramatically.
So events like Black Monday aren't billion-to-one flukes.
Mandelbrot would say absolutely not. If the bell curve ruled, yes, maybe once in the lifetime of the universe. But they happen. Why? Because markets live in Fat Tail City, where extreme volatility is part of the landscape, not a freak occurrence. This basic misunderstanding of the shape of risk makes many traditional strategies dangerously fragile.
And this idea of fat tails, of extreme events being more common, connects right back to that ruin problem we talked about earlier.
It absolutely does. If catastrophic events are more likely than you think, then the risk of hitting that gambler's ruin scenario, total wipeout, is also much higher. It applies to individuals, to companies, and yes, potentially to civilization itself if we misjudge the probability of existential threat.
We saw a pretty brutal example of this in 2020, didn't we, with those Alliance funds?
A truly stark example. Alliance Global Investors had these structured alpha funds. For years, they did well by essentially doing the opposite of Universa. They were selling options, betting that crashes wouldn't happen, collecting the premiums.
Taking pennies from in front of the steamroller, as they say.
Exactly. And then March 2020 hit. The steamroller arrived. Those funds lost a staggering $7 billion. One fund was down 97% for the year, just obliterated. Textbook gamblers ruined for their investors.
Was it just bad luck? A black swan hit them?
Not according to the regulators. It turned out the fund managers had allegedly misrepresented the risks they were taking and had secretly changed their hedging strategies, making them even more vulnerable without telling investors. They basically doubled down on the bet against disaster.
And paid the price, a $6 billion penalty for Alliance.
Yep. It shows just how catastrophic ignoring or mispricing tail risk can be. It leads to ruin.
Okay, so if selling protection leads to ruin in fat tail world, how does Universa make money buying it? How does their explosive downside protection actually work with these fat tails?
Their core strategy is buying far out of the money put options. Let's break that down again. A put gives you the right to sell an asset, like the S&P 500 index, at a set price, the strike price, before a certain date. Far out of the money means the strike price is way, way below the current market level. So low that it seems almost impossible the market will fall that far.
And those options are super cheap.
Dirt cheap. Most people think they're worthless lottery tickets. Universa buys them consistently. During normal, calm markets, yes, these options expire worthless. That's the small loss, the bleeding. Spitznagel talks about the cost of the insurance premium.
But when the crash hits...
When the market plunges a fat tail event, it can fall far enough and fast enough to blow right past those super low strike prices. Suddenly, those cheap, worthless-looking options become incredibly valuable. They pay off hundreds, sometimes thousands, of times their original cost. It's like fire insurance that pays you triple the value of your house if it burns down.
Can you give us a real example of that payoff?
The flash crash in May 2010 is perfect. Remember that. The Dow dropped 1,000 points in minutes. Chaos.
Yeah, it was terrifying to watch.
Universa had apparently bought put options that would pay off if the S&P 500 fell below 1,100. They cost maybe $2 each. During the plunge, the index hit 1066. Those $2 options briefly surged to $60 each.
Wow.
They reportedly made something like $1 billion in a single afternoon. Gone in a flash, as Spitznagel put it. It shows how quickly these fat tail events can unfold and how their strategy is designed to capture that explosive move.
It sounds so effective, yet didn't a really big, supposedly sophisticated investor actually ditch this strategy right before it paid off massively? CalPERS.
Ah, yes, the CalPERS story. It's become legendary as a cautionary tale. CalPERS, the giant California public pension fund, one of the biggest, most sophisticated investors in the world. Yeah. They had a tail hedge strategy with Universa. They were paying for that protection.
And then?
And then, under a new chief investment officer, Ben Meng, just before March 2020, they decided to scrap it. Pulled plug.
Why on earth would they do that?
The main reason cited was cost. During the long bull market leading up to 2020, paying those option premiums, the bleeding, felt like a drag on their quarterly performance numbers. It looked like wasted money when the market was only going up.
Short-term thinking overriding long-term protection.
Exactly. And then came the head-slapping folly, as the source puts it. March 2020 hits. The market crashes. And Universa, they post that chart-shattering performance, a 4,144% return on the money invested in those options.
And CalPERS missed it all.
Completely. Missed a multi-billion-dollar payday that would have cushioned their main portfolio significantly. Meng said he had no regrets, but the fallout was huge. He eventually resigned. And the guy at CalPERS who had actually managed the Universa relationship, Ron Legnato, he quit in disgust and immediately went to work for Universa.
Wow. Talk about validation for Spitznagel's approach. How does it stack up over the long run, though? Does constantly paying for insurance actually hurt returns overall?
That's the key question, and Spitznagel argues vehemently that it enhances returns. He shows data suggesting that a portfolio with, say, 97% in the S&P 500 and just 3.3% allocated to Universa's tail hedging actually produced a higher compound annual growth rate, around 12.3% over a decade, than the S&P 500 alone.
Higher. How?
Because it avoids those catastrophic drawdowns. When the market crashes, the Universa slice explodes, offsetting a large part of the loss in the main portfolio. You recover faster, you compound from a higher base, it smooths the ride and ultimately boosts long-term growth. It significantly outperforms strategies using gold, bonds, or other hedge funds as diversifiers during that same period.
So his point is risk mitigation isn't a cost center, it's a profit center over time.
Risk mitigation can and should be thought of as being additive to portfolios. That's his mantra. It lets you stay invested, stay compounding without getting wiped out.
Okay, but is this just for giant pension funds and billionaires? Can an ordinary investor get access to this kind of strategy?
Well, that's changing. In September 2020, an ETF, an exchange-traded fund called SPD, launched. Simplify U.S. Equity POS Downside Convexity.
SPD, yeah.
It's explicitly designed to be like a mini Universa for retail investors. It holds mostly S&P 500 stocks, but it allocates a small slice, maybe 3%, to buying those same kinds of far-out-of-the-money put options.
So trying to give everyday investors that same kind of crash protection.
Exactly. The goal is to help regular folks stay in the game and compound, to avoid panic selling at the bottom or getting financially ruined by a sudden crash. It's a really interesting step towards democratizing these more sophisticated tail risk hedging strategies.
Definitely something for listeners to look into if they're worried about market volatility. Okay, so we've covered the math of fat tails and strategies to deal with them. This brings us to our final and maybe most challenging section, the truly wicked problems we face. This feels like where everything converges.
It really does. We circle back to Adam Tooze's polycrisis idea here. Remember, it's not just multiple bad things happening, it's how they interact and amplify each other. The interconnectedness is key.
Globalization helped create this interconnectedness,
Yeah.
like huge benefits, but also new vulnerabilities.
Precisely. Globalization brought incredible progress, but it also wove us together through complex technologies, supply chains, financial networks, all of which can transmit shocks incredibly quickly. Think about how fast COVID spread, or how a blockage in the Suez Canal can snarl global trade.
So there's a downside to all that efficiency and connection, a specter-haunting globalization.
Yeah, the potential for cascading failures, even widespread civilizational collapse, as some commentators grimly put it. Sornette's point about complexity breeds complexity and speed breeds speed is relevant here. Things happen faster, shocks propagate further. Add in things like political polarization, fueled by social media spreading misinformation like wildfire.
Like that bomb exploding analogy for U.S. politics.
Right. Or the accelerating impacts of climate change. The megafires, the superstorms becoming routine. It creates this incredibly fragile, interdependent system where a breakdown in one part can have unpredictable, far-reaching consequences.
Which makes dealing with the root causes incredibly difficult. These are the wicked problems, right? A term from design theory.
Exactly. Coined by Horst Riddle and Melvin Weber. Wicked problems are messy, complex, unique. They don't have clear solutions, or even clear definitions sometimes. Trying to solve one aspect often creates new problems elsewhere. There's no stopping rule, no way to know when you're done, and often the solutions are irreversible. You can't just undo them if they go wrong.
Global warming sounds like the ultimate wicked problem.
Textbook example. How do you solve it? It requires global cooperation that's incredibly hard to achieve. The impacts are long-term and uncertain. The potential solutions involve transforming entire economies and societies. You can't run a controlled experiment on the planet.
And people like Rupert Reed, the environmental philosopher and activist, they see this as an emergency requiring radical action.
Absolutely. Reed, who's been involved with Extinction Rebellion, talks about the real possibility of civilizational collapse if we don't make drastic cuts to carbon emissions now. He advocates for a total transformation of society, arguing that incremental changes are just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
And the precautionary principle is central to his argument, especially against climate skeptics.
It's his way to cut through the debates about scientific uncertainty. Skeptics often say, well, the models aren't perfect, we don't know exactly how bad it will be, so let's wait and see.
Right. Delay action because of uncertainty.
The precautionary principle flips that. It says, if an action or inaction, like continuing to emit carbon, carries a plausible risk of severe or irreversible harm, like, mass human death and potential extinction, then the burden of proof isn't on those warning of the danger. It's on those who want to continue the potentially harmful activity. They have to prove it's safe.
Like, look before you leap across that deadly chasm. You don't need 100% proof you'll fall to decide maybe leaping isn't a great idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You err on the side of caution when the potential downside is catastrophic and irreversible.
And Taleb, coming from his Fat Tail City perspective, really embraced this principle too.
He did. He apparently had a conversation with Rupert Reed and realized how perfectly the precautionary principle aligned with his own thinking about avoiding ruin problems. For Taleb, things with potentially infinite downsides like creating deadly viruses in labs or systemic financial collapse or runaway climate change demand this extreme level of precaution because the potential negative consequences are just too vast, even if the probability seems low.
It also reminds me of that Brian Eno quote about losing long-term thinking.
Yeah, Eno contrasted modern society's short-term focus with olive farmers and cathedral builders who thought in terms of generations, centuries even. His point was that we've become incredibly short-sighted, unable or unwilling to act with the kind of intergenerational responsibility that these wicked problems demand.
This precautionary lens gets applied to other big, potentially transformative technologies too, right? Like GMOs.
Definitely. Taleb, for instance, is very critical of genetically modified organisms, applying the precautionary principle rigorously. His argument isn't necessarily that eating a specific GMO food today is harmful, but that messing with complex ecological and agricultural systems on a global scale with limited oversight creates a potential ruin problem.
So it's the systemic risk, the potential for unforeseen, widespread consequences down the line, like the buildup of chemicals, like Roundup you mentioned.
Exactly. It's the potential for monocultures, loss of biodiversity, unforeseen ecological impacts, chemical dependencies, the fragility of the entire industrialized food system that GMOs are part of. He sees it as a fat tail risk that we're taking without fully understanding the potential irreversible downsides.
Which contrasts sharply with people like Stuart Brand, who see GMOs as a safer, more precise form of breeding.
Right. Brand argues that genetic engineering is just a faster, more targeted version of what humans have done for millennia with selective breeding, and that it's essential for feeding a growing population in a changing climate. It's a fundamental disagreement about how to weigh potential benefits against potential catastrophic risks. Precaution versus proaction.
And then there's geoengineering. Talk about a high-stakes gamble.
Possibly the ultimate wicked problem intervention. Geoengineering proposes deliberately manipulating the Earth's climate systems on a massive scale to counteract global warming, for example, spraying aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight.
Sounds like something out of science fiction. What are the risks?
Huge, potentially catastrophic, and largely unknown. Models suggest, for instance, that stratospheric aerosol injection could drastically alter rainfall patterns, potentially eliminating or shortening the Asian monsoon season.
Which affects how many people?
Billions. Around 2 billion people rely on the monsoon for agriculture and water. Messing with that is, well, unthinkable. Rupert Reed calls geoengineering doubling down on our environmental problems, trying to fix one massive intervention, carbon emissions, with another, potentially even riskier and more unpredictable one. He sees it as a path to certain ruin.
This whole debate, precaution versus intervention, weighing present needs against future risks, seems central to another emerging philosophy. Long-termism. What's that about?
Long-termism has grown out of the effective altruism movement. It's this almost semi-apocalyptic worldview that argues our primary moral obligation is to ensure the long-term future of humanity, or even conscious life in general.
And that future is big.
Potentially vast, yeah. They talk about trillions upon trillions of potential future beings, humans on Earth, humans in space colonies, maybe even digital minds living in simulations. The sheer potential number of future lives, they argue, dwarfs the number of people alive today.
So the needs of the future outweigh the needs of the present.
That's the controversial implication. Some long-termists argue we should prioritize mitigating existential risks that could wipe out that vast future, even if it means deprioritizing current problems like poverty or disease. They advocate for and are funding extreme Hail Mary experimentation.
Like what?
Space colonization, developing superintelligent AI and trying to make it friendly. Radical genetic engineering of humans, animals, foods. Big bets aimed at securing this potentially boundless future.
How does someone like Rupert Reed view this?
With deep suspicion. He sees long-termism as potentially posing a terrible risk to civilization right now. By downplaying current crises like climate change and focusing on speculative future threats or techno-utopian solutions, he thinks they distract from urgent action needed today. And he sees their embrace of dangerous gambles as reckless, ironically potentially causing the very extinction they claim to want to prevent.
It's a profound clash of worldviews. Meanwhile, back on Wall Street, are people trying to actually put a price on some of these massive systemic risks, like climate change?
They are. Take Bob Litterman, a former top quant at Goldman Sachs, now focused entirely on climate risk. He argues climate change is absolutely a ruin problem, with potentially unbounded negative consequences.
So traditional cost-benefit analysis doesn't work.
Out the door, according to Litterman. When the worst-case scenario is infinite loss, you can't just weigh costs and benefits. He argues society is massively underpricing the risk, effectively subsidizing pollution. His climate model calls for a very high carbon price, over $100 a ton immediately, to force early mitigation. His logic: delaying action makes the problem exponentially harder and more expensive to fix later.
Makes sense. Beyond carbon pricing, is anyone trying to create, insurance for these huge systemic disasters, pandemics, massive cyber attacks, climate catastrophes?
Yes, that's where people like Marcus Schmalbach and his company RiceGex come in. They're trying to build a new kind of insurance market specifically for these systemic risks that traditional insurers often exclude or can't handle.
How would that even work? How do you insure against something so vast and interconnected?
They're using AI and blockchain to build parametric insurance. Instead of assessing actual damages after an event, which can take ages, parametric insurance pays out automatically when a pre-agreed trigger is hit.
Like what kind of trigger?
Could be anything objective and measurable. A hurricane reaching Category 4 in a specific zone, an airport being closed for more than 72 hours due to a pandemic, a specific measure of grid failure from a cyber attack, a certain virus reproduction rate being exceeded. If the trigger condition is met, the policy pays out instantly.
So, quick liquidity, right when it's needed most.
That's the idea. The huge challenge, of course, is accurately pricing that intangible systemic risk. How much premium do you charge for the risk of a global pandemic shutting down travel or a solar flare knocking out satellites? It's incredibly complex.
Seems almost impossible. Has anything conceptual ever become a real market before?
Well, think about stock options or credit default swaps like Ackman used. These were once highly specialized niche instruments, even just theoretical constructs. Now they're multi-trillion-dollar markets. So Schmalbach and others believe it's possible. They see systemic risk potentially becoming a trillion-dollar asset class. He thinks you can put a price on the black swans that could bankrupt even giant companies, something Bear Stearns or Lehman probably didn't believe possible before 2008.
It's a bold vision, trying to financialize the unfinancializable almost.
It is, and it underscores this entire conversation, really. We're living in a time of immense interconnected risks. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists still has its doomsday clock set at 100 seconds to midnight.
The closest it's ever been.
The closest ever. They put it there in January 2020, citing nuclear threats, climate change, and disruptive tech like AI and bioweapons. COVID, they said, while not an existential threat itself, was a historic wake-up call, highlighting just how unprepared we are to manage these complex global cascading crises. The doorstep to doom is no place to loiter, as they put it.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to take in. We've covered so much ground here. From Ackman's massive reactive bet against the system during COVID,
to Universa's fundamentally different approach, constantly preparing for the inevitable crash, loving to lose small amounts to win big when chaos hits.
We defined Taleb's truly unpredictable black swans and contrasted them with Sornette's potentially foreseeable dragon kings, the monsters hiding in plain sight, maybe.
And we dove into the math Mandelbrot's fat tails, explaining why extreme events are more common than standard models predict, leading to ruin if ignored, but potential opportunity if understood.
Then we wrestled with the truly wicked problems. Climate change, GMOs, geoengineering, where solutions are messy, interconnected, and often carry their own massive risks.
We looked at the clash between the precautionary principle erring on the side of caution when facing potential ruin, and long-termism's focus on maximizing a vast, speculative future, even through risky experimentation.
And finally, how innovators are trying to price these systemic risks, maybe even insure against them, turning existential threats into, potentially, a new asset class.
And the thread running through it all, maybe, is that understanding these dynamics isn't really about perfectly predicting the next crisis. As Halo said, it's the strategy, not the guess, that matters.
It's more about appreciating the deep interconnectedness, the fragility, the non-linearity of the systems we rely on, financial, environmental, societal, recognizing that the potential for extreme events is always there.
Whether you call it a black swan because you didn't see it coming, or a dragon king because maybe you could have.
Yeah.
The crucial thing is how prepared you are, how robust your strategy is.
So, for you, the listener, reflecting on all this, what's the right response in this age of polycrisis? Is it that panic early, extreme precaution approach? trying to eliminate risk wherever possible?
Or is it more like the long-termist view, taking calculated, maybe even huge risks on technological fixes or future possibilities, betting on innovation to get us through?
Spitznagel warns we're in the greatest credit bubble of human history. Scientists warn about doomsday glaciers nearing tipping points. In this world, what does having skin in the game for the future really mean?
Is it about building bunkers and avoiding risk? Or is it about strategically engaging with that risk, trying to shape a different outcome? That's the multi-trillion-dollar question maybe for all of us.